Before the frost had even lifted from the gravel that morning, a duke gave away the finest horse in 3 counties for a wooden crate of dead flowers, and every man who witnessed it was certain he had lost his mind. They were wrong. What he gained that morning, though he could not have named it yet, was the whole of his life to come. The forecourt of Ashworth Hall lay silvered with early cold, the sort of hush that precedes scandal, though none of the grooms assembled there knew yet that they were about to witness one. Blackthorn stood at the centre of it all, 17 hands of glossy black temper, the stallion the Duke of Ashworth had bred, trained and loved with an attention he rarely spared his own dining table. Men had come from as far as Yorkshire to bid on that horse's get. He had refused 1,200 guineas for him not 4 months prior, laughing the offer off as one might laugh off an insult. And yet here he stood, pen in hand, signing a bill of sale that transferred Blackthorn's ownership to a startled baronet from the next county, in exchange for nothing more than a modest, dust-caked crate of pressed botanical specimens that had arrived by carrier's cart an hour before. His groom, a broad, weathered man named Fisk, who had foaled that horse himself, stood with his cap crushed in both hands, unable to speak. Around them the Duke's usual companions, 3 gentlemen who had ridden over for nothing more than a look at the celebrated animal, exchanged glances that ranged from amusement to alarm. "You cannot mean it, Ashworth," one of them said, half laughing still, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. The Duke did not look up from the paper. "I mean it entirely." He signed his name with the same steady hand he used for ledgers and correspondence, betraying nothing, though something in his chest had gone taut and strange the moment the crate's lid had been pried open to reveal row upon row of flowers, pressed flat as memory, labelled in a careful, unadorned hand that he did not recognize and could not stop looking at. The baronet, delighted beyond measure and faintly suspicious that he was being made a fool of, led Blackthorn away within the quarter hour, the horse's hooves ringing sharp against the frozen stone, and did not look back. Fisk did. He stood a long while staring after the horse he had raised from a foal, then turned that same disbelieving stare upon his master, who had already crouched beside the crate as if it contained something far more precious than paper and stems. No one in that forecourt understood what had just happened, least of all the Duke himself. He only knew that his hands, so long steady and unmoved by anything, would not stop trembling as he lifted the first pressed bloom into the grey morning light. "Hello, and welcome back. Settle in, pour something warm, and let's talk for just a moment before we return to that forecourt, to that trembling hand, to that horse being led away into the cold. If you're new here, this is a story about a duke who gave up the finest animal in his stables for a crate of pressed flowers, and about the woman whose whole quiet life was folded into those pages without his knowing it. It sounds, I know, like madness. Perhaps it was, but stay with me, because by the end you may find yourself agreeing that it was the sanest thing he ever did. The first true decision of a man who had spent years simply enduring his own life rather than living it. If stories like this move you, stories of buried grief and slow thawing hearts, of quiet women whose worth is finally seen, of houses that learn to breathe again, then I'd ask only this small thing of you: press subscribe, so you don't miss where this one goes. And leave a comment below telling me what you make of a man who trades a stallion for a stranger's herbarium. Would you have done the same, on some instinct you couldn't name? Or would you have called it, as his friends surely will, an act of folly bordering on ruin? Hold that question, we'll come back to it. For now, know only this: the Duke of Ashworth did not yet understand why his chest had gone tight at the sight of those pressed blooms, why his hands would not be still, why a woman he had never met already seemed to live somewhere behind his ribs. He would understand, in time. It would cost him a great deal to get there: his pride, his composure, the careful architecture of numbness he had built around himself since the loss that first hollowed him out. But cost is not the same as waste. Some trades are not made with the mind at all, but with whatever is left of the heart after long neglect, reaching blindly toward the one thing that might wake it. So let us go back now, back before the forecourt, before the bill of sale, before Blackthorn's hooves rang out on frozen stone, to the woman whose hands had once touched every flower in that crate, and to the long, quiet years that made her invisible to everyone except, in the end, to him. Her name was Miss Eleanor Vane, and for most of her 24 years she had been the sort of woman rooms forgot the moment she left them. She was the third and youngest daughter of the late Reverend Josiah Vane, a country parson of good family and no fortune whatsoever, a man who had loved his God, his books, and his garden with equal fervour, and left his daughters upon his death. Very little beyond a modest cottage, a quantity of debt, and the example of his own quiet devotion to small overlooked things. Eleanor had inherited that devotion whole, while her elder sisters had been sent, in better years, to dancing masters and watercolour tutors in hopes of catching some passing squire's eye. Eleanor had trailed her father through hedgerow and churchyard and water meadow with a wooden press strapped to her back like a soldier's pack, learning the Latin names of things before she learned to properly hem a gown. She could tell you, by the shape of a leaf alone, whether a plant would soothe a fever, or stop a wound's bleeding, or do nothing at all but look lovely in a border. She could tell you where the first wood anemones would break ground in March, and where, in August, the bee orchids hid themselves among the chalk grass so shyly that a careless walker might tread 100 underfoot without ever knowing. None of this, her mother had informed her with some regularity, was of the smallest use to a woman who must some day be married. And so Eleanor had learned, as clever unwanted daughters so often must, to make herself small. She pressed her flowers at night by candle stub after the mending was done and her sisters asleep, cataloguing each specimen in a careful, unadorned hand, genus, habitat, date, a line or two of private observation, filling notebook after notebook that no one but she would ever think to open. She learned to set aside her own wants as easily as she set aside a chipped teacup, without comment, without complaint. When her father died and left them nothing, she nursed her mother through the long grey illness that followed. When her mother died in turn, she took in mending, then a little teaching, then whatever paid work a gentlewoman without connections could decently accept. And through all of it, in whatever hour she could steal, she kept pressing flowers, kept writing her small exact observations in the margins, as though some part of her refused to believe that the one true thing she had ever made would go forever unseen. She did not know, on the cold morning she finally sold the whole of that life's work to settle a dead cousin's debts, that a duke's careless, aching hands would be the ones to open the crate. She only knew that something in her chest had torn quietly loose as the carrier's cart pulled away, carrying 20 years of her attention toward a stranger who would never understand what he held. She was wrong about that too. In time, he would understand it better than anyone alive. To understand why a duke would trade a horse worth 1,100 guineas for a crate of dead flowers, one must first understand what had already been traded out of him, years before, without his consent. Julian Ashworth had not always been a man who counted his hours by the striking of a stable clock. He had once laughed easily, had once ridden hell for leather across his own fields, for no better reason than the pleasure of the wind, had once been, by every account of those who remembered him young, a man of considerable warmth. That man had been buried, in every sense but the literal one, on a March morning 11 years past, when his younger brother Edmund had gone out onto ice too thin to bear a man's weight, and had not come back. Julian had been the one to find him. He had been the one to carry him home across his own saddle, the small, terrible weight of him. And he had been the one to stand in the frost afterward and understand, with the flat clarity of a man closing an account, that grief of that particular size could not be survived by feeling it fully. And so he had not. He had built, brick by careful brick, a life of ritual in its place, the same hour for breakfast, the same route for his morning ride, the same ledger entries in the same steady hand, the same closed doors along the same silent corridors of a house that had once rung with two brothers' voices and now rang with none. He called this peace. He told his mother, when she pressed him, that he had never been calmer in his life, and he believed it, the way a man convinces himself a scar no longer aches simply because he has stopped touching it. He gave his affection, what remained of it, to the one place that asked nothing of him in return, the stables. He knew every horse in his care, by temperament as well as by name, understood a shying gelding the way he no longer troubled to understand a grieving tenant or a lonely mother, and it was there, among the warm animal smell of hay and leather, that something in him that still lived was allowed, briefly, to breathe. His household knew this well enough. The servants had learned to read his moods by the state of the stable yard rather than by his face, which gave away nothing at all. He was, by every outward measure, an excellent duke, prompt, correct, generous within reason, scrupulously fair. He was also, though he would not have named it so, a man entirely absent from his own life, standing just outside its door, mistaking the silence within for peace, because he had forgotten what the noise of feeling anything had ever sounded like. The crate that undid the Duke of Ashworth's peace had begun its life in far humbler circumstances than the forecourt where it was won and lost. It had sat, until 3 weeks before, in the low front parlor of a rented cottage in Nettlecombe, stacked upon a deal table beside a single tallow candle, while Miss Eleanor Vane went through it leaf by leaf, folder by folder, for what she believed would be the last time. She was not sentimental by habit. She had learned young that sentiment was a luxury the poor could not afford to keep in the house, along with coal in July or a second helping at dinner. But her hands had shaken none the less as she tied the final ribbon around the last folio, because the herbarium represented 11 years of her life pressed flat between sheets of paper, and she was about to sell it to a stranger for the price of a dead man's debts. The dead man was her cousin Thomas Vane, a solicitor's clerk of modest means and immodest habits, who had died owing sums to 3 separate creditors in Bath, and had named Eleanor, in a fit of misplaced family feeling, as the one relation steady enough to see the estate settled honourably. There had been no money in the estate. There had been, instead, a widow with 2 small children, and a stack of demand letters, growing more severe by the week, and Eleanor, who could not bear the thought of Thomas's name going into a debtor's grave of disgrace, on top of an actual one, had done the only sum that made any sense to her. She had catalogued her own life's work as an asset. She had written, in the same careful hand she used for her botanical labels, a description of the collection's scope and condition, and she had sent it to 3 dealers in London who traded in scientific curiosities, offering the whole for whatever it would fetch. It was not vanity that made her believe it worth something. It was the plain, unglamorous knowledge that she had done the work properly. With taxonomic rigor, no dealer could fault, though she never once imagined the buyer would be a duke, still less that he would pay for it not in coin, but in a horse worth 4 times what any dealer had offered. She had asked only for enough to clear Thomas's debts and keep her own small household solvent through the winter. She had not asked, because she had long ago stopped expecting it, that anyone should understand what the collection had cost her to build, or what it meant to send it away in a plain wooden crate addressed to an estate she had never seen. To a man whose name she recognized only as one is meant to recognize the names of the great, from a distance, the way one recognizes weather. Word of the trade reached the club before Blackthorn's stall had gone cold, and it did the rounds of White's and Brooks's with the swiftness peculiar to news that flatters everyone who repeats it, for there is no pleasure quite so complete as watching a great man make a fool of himself in public. Lord Hartley, who had once lost £400 to Ashworth at Faro without so much as a raised eyebrow, could not now speak of the Duke without a laugh escaping him, as though the memory itself were ticklish. A horse for a box of dead weeds, he said, to anyone who would listen, and there were many who would. I have heard of men ruined by cards, by wine, by women. I have never heard of a man ruined by botany. Sir Robert Ainsworth, who fancied himself a wit, suggested that Ashworth ought to be examined by a physician, for surely no sound mind traded a Derby-class stallion for a crate of pressed leaves. However prettily labelled, he proposed, to general laughter, that the Duke be committed to Bedlam alongside his herbarium. The two of them kept in adjoining rooms for company. Even Fisk, loyal as he was, could not entirely hold his tongue, muttering to the undergroom that his Grace had gone soft in the head, that grief did strange things to a man given time enough to sit with it, and that no good ever came of a gentleman keeping his own counsel so long that he forgot the difference between a horse and a hobby. The steward, Mr. Prynne, smiling his soft, agreeable smile, called it eccentricity when he spoke of it below stairs, and something graver when he wrote of it in his private correspondence, for eccentricity in a duke who managed his own affairs closely was a temporary inconvenience. But eccentricity in a duke, grown careless of his affairs, was. To a steward who had grown comfortable skimming the edges of ledgers no one troubled to examine, something nearer to opportunity. None of them said it to the Duke's face. None of them needed to. He heard it anyway, in the pauses after his name was mentioned, in the particular quality of silence that follows a joke just finished. He said nothing in return, offered no defence, for he had none that would satisfy them, and, in truth, none that satisfied himself. And yet each night, after the house had gone still, and the last candle in every other window had been snuffed, he sat alone in the library, with the crate open before him, and turned the pages of Eleanor Vane's herbarium one by one, tracing the careful hand of her labels, unable to say why a stranger's pressed flowers should hold him longer than his brandy, longer than his correspondence, longer than anything had held him in 11 years. She came to Ashworth Hall on a grey Tuesday in late autumn, in a hired gig that jolted over the last mile of rutted lane, with a single trunk, a smaller box of instruments, a bone folder, a pressing screw, twine, and a letter of engagement so brief it might have been written by a man who had forgotten, halfway through, why he was writing it at all. The letter named her a companion to no one in particular, an assistant of some undefined sort to the estate's neglected records of plantings and orangery stock, at a salary modest enough that Eleanor had wept, once, quietly over the relief of it, and told no one why. She had written to the new owner of her cousin's effects, for so she still thought of him, a name on a bill of sale, Ashworth. Nothing more, asking only after a small tin box of seed she had failed to include in the crate, cuttings from her mother's garden that she could not, in conscience, let go to a stranger unmarked. The answer that came back was not from the Duke, but from his steward, a Mr. Prynne, whose hand was very fine, and whose phrases were very warm, and which somehow, by the end of 3 paragraphs, had transformed a request for a tin box into an offer of a position. She had not fully understood, reading it by candlelight in her cousin's widow's borrowed parlour, that she was accepting a place in the household of the very man who now owned every pressed leaf she had ever gathered. She understood it within an hour of arriving. The housekeeper, a broad, unhurried woman named Mrs. Yarrow, met her in the forecourt with a lamp already lit against the early dark, and looked at her for a long moment before she spoke, in the particular way of servants who have learned to read a person's worth from the set of their shoulders rather than the cut of their cloak. "You'll be wanting the east rooms," she said. "They're aired. Not much else is in this house, but they're aired." Eleanor followed her through a hall in which perhaps a third of the doors stood shut and sheeted. Portraits turned to the wall in two of the sitting rooms she passed, a ballroom whose chandelier had not been lit by the dust upon it in a decade. The gardens, glimpsed through a long window as they climbed, lay black and unpruned beneath the frost, rose beds gone to briar. A knot garden dissolved past reading. She said nothing of it. She had learned, in a life of small houses and smaller means, never to remark on what was not her business, and this, whatever silence had settled over this great cold house, was plainly not yet her business. But she noted it the way she noted the condition of soil, without judgment, only observation, filing it away as she had once filed every specimen, labelled, dated, understood before it was ever spoken of. Mrs. Yarrow, watching her do this, without knowing quite what she watched, thought only that the new girl had a still sort of face, and gentle hands, and did not flinch at the dust, and decided, before Eleanor had so much as unpacked her trunk, that she would do. The frost bed behind the orangery had been given up for dead by every gardener who had looked at it in 3 winters, and it was here, on her 4th morning at Ashworth Hall, that Eleanor first made herself known to the household, in a way that could not be filed away as mere impression. She had asked leave of no one. She had simply gone out before breakfast in her oldest cloak, a trowel borrowed from the boot-room, and knelt in the blackened earth as though it were an old acquaintance, turning back mulch that had been left to rot into a crust, testing the soil between her fingers, murmuring to herself the names of things long since given up for lost beneath the frost-heave: sedum, hellebore, the woody stock of a rosemary hedge someone had planted and no one had pruned. In a decade. By the time the second gardener, a boy named Tam, found her there, she had cleared 2 full yards of bed and set aside, in a neat and separate pile, every root that still showed green beneath the bark. "That's dead, miss," he told her, not unkindly. "Has been since Michaelmas." She only handed him the trowel and asked him to cut here, not there, and when he obeyed, uncertain why he did. The pale wound in the stem showed living wood beneath the dead, and he said nothing more, only stared at her the way one stares at a card trick one cannot account for. Within the week the bed was turned, top-dressed, and mulched against the coming frost in a manner so precise, so evidently practised, that Mrs. Yarrow, watching from the still-room window with her arms folded over her apron, remarked to no one in particular that the new girl gardened the way some women prayed, with her whole attention, and no thought of being watched. She did not know she was being watched even then. 2 days later it was the household ledgers, left for her by mistake or by design, she was never quite certain which, a stack of accounts from the home farm that Mr. Bellamy the steward had apparently not found time to reconcile in some weeks. She corrected 3 errors in an afternoon without comment, in a neat hand that matched the entries already there, so exactly that had she not mentioned it to Mrs. Yarrow, no one would have known the sums had ever been wrong at all. She corrected them not to expose anyone, but because a wrong sum offended her the way an unweeded bed offended her, as a thing left undone that could be done. And when word came from the home farm that old Grissom's wife lay fevered, and his 3 children unfed, it was Eleanor who walked the mile in the cold with beef tea and barley water and a jar of her mother's cough syrup, and sat 2 hours by the woman's bed, reading to her from an old prayer book in a voice so low and steady that the fever, whether by grace or by coincidence, broke before midnight. None of this was done for witnesses. All of it was witnessed. Mrs. Yarrow said little, as was her habit, but she began, without quite deciding to leave the household keys where Eleanor might find them if needed, and to speak of her, in the servants' hall, not as the new one but as Miss Hartley, with a weight on the name that servants reserve for those they have quietly decided to trust. Mr. Bellamy noticed the ledgers first, because it was Mr. Bellamy's business to notice such things, and for 3 days he said nothing at all. He was a neat, soft-spoken man of 45, with the kind of face that arranged itself easily into agreeableness, a face that had served him well through 14 years of managing the Ashworth accounts largely unwatched. He smiled at the servants. He smiled at the tenants when he raised their rents. He smiled above all at the Duke, who had not looked closely at a column of figures since the year his brother died, and who had come, without ever quite intending it, to trust Mr. Bellamy's smile the way a man trusts a familiar chair, without testing whether it will bear his weight. It was this trust, cultivated so patiently and for so long, that Eleanor Hartley had disturbed in the space of an afternoon, correcting 3 years of quietly misreckoned feed accounts, with nothing more than a borrowed pen and the unhurried attention she gave to a page of pressed roots. She had not known whose error she corrected. She had not asked. It did not occur to her that a sum could be a secret, or that setting one right might make of her an enemy. But Mr. Bellamy understood it at once, and understood, too, that a woman capable of finding 14 years of small discrepancies in an afternoon was a woman who, given time and the housekeeper's keys, might find a great deal more. He was not, it should be said, a villain of the theatrical sort. He did not scheme in firelit rooms with steepled fingers, and he told himself, in the private accounting he kept apart from the estates, that he had never taken more than the house could spare, that a man must look to his own future in a world that granted stewards no pensions and no thanks. Fear, not greed, was the truer engine of him, though the two had long since become impossible to separate. And so he did what such men do. He did not accuse her. He did not confront her. He only began, very gently, to make himself heard wherever she was praised. To Mrs. Yarrow he wondered aloud, smiling, whether it was quite proper for a young person of uncertain situation to be given the run of the house so soon. To the Duke, on the rare evenings his Grace could be drawn into conversation, he observed, mildly, that Miss Hartley seemed a most industrious young woman, and that industrious young women, in reduced circumstances, sometimes had reasons of their own for making themselves indispensable to great houses. He never said more than that. He never needed to. A seed planted in mild soil needs no violence to take root, and Mr. Bellamy was a patient gardener of a very different sort than the one now reviving the beds behind the orangery, cultivating doubt instead of frost-bitten stock, and smiling, always smiling, while he did it. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth arrived on a Tuesday, without warning, in a carriage so old and so well kept that it seemed less a conveyance than a small, moving assertion of family pride, and she came down from it the way other women descended a staircase to greet applause. She was small, upright, dressed in unfashionable black that somehow made every fashionable woman in the county look overdressed by comparison, and she had not been in the front hall for the space of 2 minutes before she had taken the measure of the shut doors, the sheeted furniture glimpsed through a half-open library, and her son's face, and found all three wanting. "Well," she said, "to no one and to everyone, this house smells like a mausoleum that has given up hoping for visitors." Julian, summoned from the stable still in his riding coat, bent to kiss her hand with the particular wariness of a man greeting a very small, very accurate cannon. "Mother, don't mother me in that voice, as though I've come to bury you. I've come because Selina wrote to say you'd traded Blackthorn for a box of dead flowers, and I confess I had to see for myself whether my son had gone mad or merely stupid, the two conditions being distinguishable, in my experience, only by degree." She did not wait for his answer. She asked instead for tea, and for the housekeeper, and, with the unerring instinct of a woman who had spent 40 years reading rooms the way other people read newspapers, for Miss Hartley, whose name she had somehow already acquired before crossing the threshold. Eleanor was found in the still-room, sleeves pinned back, hands stained faintly green from crushed comfrey, and she came to the drawing-room expecting reprimand, and received instead an inspection so thorough and so silent that she felt, for the length of it, rather like one of her own specimens laid flat beneath glass. The Duchess looked at her hands. She looked at the darn in her cuff, plainly visible and plainly mended by the wearer's own needle. She looked, longest of all, at her eyes, which did not drop. "You corrected the feed ledgers," the Duchess said at last, "not a question. I only noticed a discrepancy, your Grace, and thought it proper to mention it. You revived the orangery bed that Bellamy told my son was beyond saving. The roots were not dead, only resting, and you sat up 3 nights with Grissom's wife, who is nothing to you, and asked nothing for it." Eleanor, unused to being catalogued so plainly herself, said only, "She was ill, your Grace, and there was no one else." The Duchess turned then to her son, and to Bellamy, who had appeared in the doorway with his usual mild and helpful smile, as though he had merely come to see whether more tea was wanted. "I have known industrious young women before," the Duchess said, to the room at large in the flat, carrying voice of a woman who had buried a husband and outlived 2 seasons of gossip about her own conduct, "and I have known charming men who mind everyone's business but their own ledgers, and I find, on the whole, that I trust the first far more than the second. Bellamy, you may go." He went, still smiling, though something behind the smile had gone very still. The Duchess did not watch him leave. She was already looking at her son, and at the girl he could not stop glancing toward, and she said nothing further on the subject that day, but she had said, everyone in that room understood, quite enough. It was 3 days later that the ledgers came out properly, and with them the ruin of Mr. Bellamy's long, quiet peace. The occasion was ordinary enough on its surface. The quarter's accounts were due to be presented to the Duke for his signature, a formality Julian had performed for 11 years without troubling to read more than the final sums, trusting his steward as a man trusts a well-oiled gate to swing true simply because it always has. But the Duchess had asked, in her flat, unhurried way, to see the books herself before dinner, and Eleanor, summoned to fetch a missing folio of receipts from the estate office, for no other reason than that she happened to be nearest the door when the request was made, found herself standing in the library with the account books open across the long table, and a column of figures beneath her eye that did not agree with themselves. She had spent enough years balancing her father's meagre curacy accounts against the price of specimen paper and postage to know a false total when she saw one. The eye that had catalogued 4,000 pressed leaves by genus and habitat was not an eye easily deceived by a badly disguised subtraction. She said nothing at first. She had learned, in a life of being overlooked, the wisdom of silence. But the Duchess, watching her face rather than the page, said only, "Well, Miss Hartley, you have found something. You had better say what it is, since you have clearly already found the courage to think it." And so, in a voice she did not recognize as her own for its steadiness, Eleanor said that the sums for the tenant repairs at Lower Combe did not match the receipts, that they had not matched for some years, and that the difference, small each quarter, but compounded now across what looked to be a decade, was not small at all. Bellamy, called for, arrived still smiling, and said there must be some misunderstanding, that young ladies were not generally schooled in estate accounts, and might mistake the ordinary untidiness of figures for something more sinister than it was. It was the Duke who spoke then, and the room went very quiet to hear him, for Julian had said little in all this, and had seemed. To the servants watching, a man standing at some distance from his own house. "Show me the untidiness, then," he said, and his voice had in it something none of them had heard before. Not the flat courtesy he kept for steel and slate roofs, but the low, dangerous patience of a man discovering, all at once, that he had been made a fool of in his own home for longer than he cared to count. Bellamy could not show him. There was nothing to show, only the neat false hand of a man who had believed no one left in that house would ever trouble to look closely again, and looking now, at last, at the woman who had troubled to look, Julian felt something in his chest give way that had been sealed shut since the churchyard at Ashworth. Some old numb wall cracking under the plain, unbearable fact of her honesty. The library filled slowly, as such rooms do when a house senses that something is about to be settled in it once and for all. First Fisk, summoned on no pretext but his own instinct for occasions, then Mrs. Hale wiping her hands on her apron as though she might be asked to give evidence herself. Then 2 of the upper servants, who had no business there, and knew it, and came anyway. Standing near the door with the particular stillness of people determined not to be sent away. The Dowager Duchess took the chair nearest the fire and folded her hands and said nothing, which was, of everyone in that room, the most alarming thing she could have done. Bellamy stood before the long table with the ledgers open upon it, the false hand exposed now under 3 pairs of eyes that had learned at last to read it, and he attempted, twice, the smile that had carried him through 14 years of small and patient theft. It did not carry him now. Lower Coombe, Julian said, and laid his finger upon a column of figures as though the number itself were a wound, was billed for repairs to 4 cottages in the year of my brother's death. I have walked past those cottages 100 times since. 2 of them were never touched. Bellamy began an explanation about masons and delayed contracts and the difficulty of country tradesmen, and the explanation died somewhere in the middle of itself, because no one in the room was listening to it, least of all Eleanor, who stood a little apart with the folios still in her hands and watched the Duke discover, in real time, the shape of what had been done to him. "You will produce the receipts," Julian said, "or you will produce the truth. I find I no longer have patience for a third thing. There were no receipts. There had never been receipts, only the neat compounding fiction of a man who had counted, correctly, on a widowed household too grieved and too incurious to look twice at its own accounts, until a woman with no stake in the matter beyond her own honesty had looked once, and looked hard, and found him out. The Duchess spoke then, for the first time since entering the room, and her voice was perfectly level. 14 years, Miss Bellamy. I make it some £1,100, at a rough sum, though I dare say Miss Ashwood could correct me to the shilling. Eleanor could have. She did not, out of a mercy she had not planned to extend, and could not now withhold, and something in that restraint seemed to strike Julian harder than the sum itself had done. He turned to her before the whole room, and the courtesy went out of his face, and what was left was plain and unguarded, and almost frightening in its nakedness. "You knew," he said, "the very first evening, looking at that ledger, and you said nothing to spare me the shame of learning it in front of my own mother." "I said nothing," Eleanor answered, "because it was not my place to accuse a man I could not yet prove guilty. I am not in the habit of ruining people on suspicion, your Grace, however much I may have wished to." "No," Julian said. "Lo, you are in the habit of tending things others have left to rot. My orangery, my ledgers, and here he stopped, because the word that wanted to come next was not one he had spoken aloud since a churchyard 8 years gone, and it frightened him more than Bellamy's fraud, more than £1,100, more than anything that had happened in that room. The Dowager Duchess, watching her son falter on the edge of a sentence he could not finish, did the household the small mercy of looking at the fire instead of at him, and said nothing at all, which was, from her, the loudest kindness in the room. "Right, quick pause before we go on, because I have to ask you something. If you were the Duke of Ashworth, standing in that forecourt, with the reins of the finest stallion in the county in your hand, and a stranger's crate of pressed flowers on the ground before you, would you have made the trade? No haggling, no coin, no sensible half-measure, just blackthorn for a box of dried roots and paper. Everyone around him thought he'd taken leave of his senses, and for the longest time, so did he. And yet here we are, 13 chapters in, and I think you'll agree it was the shrewdest bargain the man ever struck, though he wouldn't have called it that at the time, and he still can't quite say why he did it, not even to himself. Not even now with Bellamy exposed and the ledgers set right, and Eleanor Ashworth's, forgive me, Eleanor's, quiet hand visible in every corner of that house that used to sit shuttered and cold. If you're enjoying this one, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me what you'd have done in his position, kept the horse, or gambled on the crate. I read every one of them, and I am always a little astonished at how many of you say you'd have made the same mad trade, sight unseen, on nothing but instinct. Maybe that says something true about all of us, that we know a good bargain when it's staring us in the face, even when it makes no sense on paper. Now, back to Ashworth Hall, where a duke has just choked on a word he has not spoken since a churchyard 8 years gone, where a dowager duchess is studying her own fire rather than her son's face out of something very like mercy, and where a woman who once catalogued flowers in secret because no one thought to ask what she wanted is about to learn what it costs a shut and grieving house to finally begin to open its doors. There is still a steward's fate to be decided, still a horse whose absence aches in an empty stable, still a sentence hanging unfinished in the library air. We are not done yet, not by a long way. Let's get back to it. Bellamy was gone within the week, though gone gently, as such things were measured at Ashworth Hall. There was no constable summoned to the gravel forecourt, no public accounting read aloud in the village square. The Dowager Duchess had counselled proportion, and Julian, to his own quiet surprise, had found he agreed with her. Restitution was made from what remained of Bellamy's savings, a sum that did not nearly cover the £1,100, but was, Eleanor said, enough to mend the worst of the lower combe roofs before winter closed in again. Bellamy left with a character reference so carefully worded it praised nothing and condemned nothing, and a warning, delivered by the Duchess herself in a voice like a closing door, that he was never to set foot on Ashworth land again. It was mercy. It was also, everyone understood, an ending. Blackthorn came home in the first week of October, led up the long drive by Grissom's own hand, and the stallion's return was met with more open weeping among the stable hands than the estate had seen in years, though none of them would afterward admit to it. Julian stood at the paddock rail a long while that evening, one hand resting on the gate exactly as it had rested the morning he signed the beast away, and when Eleanor came to stand beside him, uninvited, he did not send her off. He had, by then, stopped sending her off from anywhere. It was a smaller thing, some months later, when the first of the new foals was born in the coldest hour before dawn, slick and trembling and already, Grissom swore, possessed of his sire's temper. Julian named her himself, without consultation, without ceremony, standing in the straw in his shirt-sleeves at 4 a.m, Eleanor. Fisk, when told, permitted himself the smallest smile he had shown in a decade, and said only that it was a fitting name for something that had been worth more than anyone first reckoned. The herbarium itself was given a wall, not a drawer, not a trunk in the box-room where it had once waited to be forgotten, but a wall in the library, glass-fronted, where the pressed roses and the meadow grasses and the small violet Eleanor's mother had loved could be seen by anyone who came to sit by the fire, catalogued now in Eleanor's own careful hand beneath Julian's brother's old bookshelves. It was there, one evening in November, with frost thick on the garden beds outside, and the fire burned low, that Julian finally said the word he had choked on in the library before witnesses. There was no one to witness it now but Eleanor herself. "I love you," he said plainly, the way a man states a fact he has verified beyond doubting. "I have for some time. I did not have the courage to say it while I still believed love was a debt that only ever came due in grief." Eleanor did not look away from him, though her hands, folded in her lap, trembled very slightly. You traded a horse for pressed flowers, she said, and called it madness for months. What changed? I stopped mistaking numbness for peace, Julian said. You taught me that, cataloguing everything I had let wither, without ever once asking what it cost you to look at me and see something worth saving. Outside, the roses that would not survive till spring stood black-edged in the frost, and inside, the fire caught the glass of the herbarium case and threw small bright reflections across the room, flowers within flowers, preserved and doubled. Eleanor reached for his hand and did not let go, and neither, this time, did he. Thank you all so much for staying with this one to the very end. If you found yourself hoping for Eleanor, or aching for Julian, or simply wanting to shout at Bellamy through the screen, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and tell me honestly, would you have traded the stallion? Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story.